That morning, the press conference voice lifted my name like a punchline, not as a contributor, but as a mistake. The room smelled of coffee and polished wood, of power and shortcuts. And when the host announced the breakthrough, my trusted partner stepped to the mic and thanked everyone for this remarkable collaboration. Then he looked at me, and his smile paused as if he just remembered I wasn't supposed to be there at all. In the next breath, he said my contribution had been exploratory, marginal, not the core of the study. And with that, the credit slid away from me like a bucket of cold water poured down the wrong throat. The room clapped. I stood, listening to my own name vanish, while the man who'd promised to guard my voice shook hands with the very people who'd laughed at my ridiculous dream. That moment didn't just sting. It erased me from a future I'd been asked to believe in. I walked out with my lab coat fluttering behind me, the corridor swallowing my voice as if the walls themselves agreed with the verdict. My family's faces flickered in my mind, my mother's hopeful insistence that I'd prove them wrong, my father's quiet cynicism dressed up as practical wisdom. And the scientists who'd whispered that urban mycology was fringe pseudoscience, they'd sharpen their knives with every talk I gave, with every new slide I prepared. With every sip of coffee I tried to swallow between rejections. I felt ridiculous, I felt betrayed, and I felt stubbornly unbroken. Pain led to a decision I didn't articulate for months. I'd defend myself to people who'd already decided. I would pivot. If my field wouldn't give me a stage, I'd build one elsewhere. The quiet hallways of a lab gave way to the loud, messy arbors of the city. Oxygen and fungi learning to breathe together in the open. Urban mycology, I discovered, isn't just about pretty mushrooms on a page. It's about networks. Mycelium as infrastructure, fungi as air filters, compost as ballast for urban resilience. The ridicule I'd carried like a badge became the fuel for an obsession. How to turn barren roofs and vacant lots into living lungs for a city starved of clean air. The early days were brutal. Nights in a borrowed garage lab, jars tumbling in the sink. A stair-step of tiny victories that strangers called luck, but I knew were weeks of stubborn discipline wearing away at doubt. Climate scientists called it fringe because it didn't fit the neat graphs they'd trained themselves to worship. They didn't see the way a living filament could snare micropollutants, or how a network of fungal filters could ride on train tunnels and parkways, whisking away soot and volatile compounds that clogged the air like a legacy of failure. Yet in that mess, I found a rhythm. The city's breath whispered to me, the bus's diesel sighs, the bakery ovens, the sweet rot of compost in the sun, and I learned to listen. I spoke less. I built more. I learned the language of mycelium and hydraulics and urban microclimates until the two fused into something that felt less like science and more like care. Funding came slower than the dawn, but it came with people who cared about outcome more than pedigree. A small city granted me a municipal pilot. A patchwork of rooftops and alleys, a schoolyard near a refinery, a concrete beltline where air quality was a judgment passed on every resident. We installed mycofilters, fungal networks that breathed through membranes and sucked particulates from the air, paired with biochar and green roofs to anchor the system. The results were small at first, then undeniable. PM levels dipped, odor softened, the air tasted lighter on the tongue. The first school air began to feel like clean water, rare, surprising, something you hadn't believed could exist in your daily routine. Years passed, and the city watched as dead zones turned hopeful. I turned barren lots into microforests, not with a rhetoric that preached transformation, but with living, stubborn growth. The fringe field became a backbone of environmental biotech air purification as a civic utility, not a moonshot for a Hall of Fame. And then, like a river breaking through a dam, opportunities multiplied. A coalition of cities wanted pilots, investors wanted scale, and the scientists who'd once called me a fool began to acknowledge the sincerity behind the data. I wasn't making art to prove I belonged. I was producing outcomes that made breath cheaper, cleaner, possible for 100 neighborhoods that had learned to fear the air they could not see. I returned home after a particularly loud applause for a citywide rollout, the kind you feel in your bones long after the lights have dimmed. The old house sat on a street that looked the same but felt smaller, as if the world had opened out beyond it while I stayed behind a few inches. The plan was simple. I'd visit, stay a night, and tell the truth I'd learned in public air and private soil. The family greeted me with the awkward warmth of people who want to celebrate but suspect a trap. My sister asked if I'd finally got a real job. My father asked if I'd considered returning to the lab but keeping my feet on the ground. My mother, with the gentlest despair, asked if I'd eaten, if I'd slept. They didn't yet understand that what I'd become hadn't happened in a conference hall, but in the dirt and rain and sun of cities that finally breathed again. Then came the scene that etched itself into the memory like a watermark you can't erase. A public square near the old industrial spine had been redesigned as a living plaza, awning walls, rain gardens, and a living canopy of fungal networks threaded into panels that hung like green rain. A crowd gathered as the mayor, the city's environmental chief, and I cut the ribbon for what they called the Airward Project. But it wasn't the ribbon that told the truth. It was what happened when the first gust carried through the plaza. The air changed. It wasn't a gust. Not at first, but a distinct lift, a cooling, a sweetness, the tangible sigh that you could feel in your throat. A child rode past in a stroller and took a deep breath as if tasting something she'd never known a breath could taste. An elderly man stopped to touch the living wall, his wrinkles softening as if they'd finally learned to relax. The fungal panels glowed faintly with moisture and life, and a chorus of small, astonished sounds rose from the crowd. Gasps, a laugh, a sob. My mother cried quietly, as if she'd been holding her breath for decades and finally released. My father stood rigid, and then he whispered almost to himself, "So this is what you meant by stubborn hope." The moment wasn't about vindication. It was about consequence, the kind you can't dodge by ignoring it. My family's earlier derision had stung for years, but it hadn't altered the truth I'd found. You don't owe your dreams to those who refuse to see you. You owe them to the world you want to heal. Watching them observe what I'd become, what we'd become together, whether they believed in it or not, felt like the closing of a loop, a karma's ledger balancing itself with interest paid in lungs instead of dollars. When the sun dipped behind the city's high towers, I spoke softly to them, not to counsel their doubts, but to invite them into the work that had redeemed my stubbornness. I told them that the dream that felt ridiculous in the faculty lounge had grown into a shared thing air that breathes with us, soil that remembers the rain, a science that refuses to be limited by old rumors. The truth wasn't that I had proved them wrong. It was that the world had given us a chance to prove something right together, that even the most unlikely seed can erupt into a forest if you tend it with care, patience, and an honest will to keep going when the people who should know better doubt you. The ledger closed that night, not in retribution, but in clarity. I'd learned that success isn't a weapon to punish those who mocked you. It's a message to spare others the ache you carried, to show them a future that is possible when weird becomes useful and stubborn hope becomes practical care. My family stood by the plaza's edge, watching the spectacle of a city learning to breathe again. And the silence between us changed, soft, hopeful, and real. I'd chosen an absurd path because I wanted the world to be kinder to breath and soil. The world responded with a chorus of cities, not applause alone, but a network of living lungs and thriving ecosystems. The laughter toward my ridiculous dream had become a prelude to something generous, a life where even the most unlikely dream can become not only possible, but essential. If you're listening because you've ever felt ridiculous for dreaming something too big, know this. You aren't wrong to fight for ale and roots for the species you love. The ledger isn't a verdict. It's an invitation to balance fear with work, to turn mockery into meaning, to plant something that outlasts the noise. And when the world finally shifts its gaze and pulls you winner, you don't just win for yourself. You win for every stubborn dreamer who chose to keep sowing, knowing the air you breathe could one day be shared by 100 neighborhoods, 100 more lives, and a family that learns to stand taller. Not because they were proved right, but because the world proved compassion and courage could be contagious.